Of the tank destroyers built here by the armaments companies Henschel and Ruhestahl, later Rheinstahl Hanumarkt, the German Army operated 770 units between 1965 and 1991, which were used in the independent tank destroyer companies of the brigades, the 5th so-called heavy companies of the armored infantry battalions, the armored infantry brigades, and, until the end of 1968, also the 5th companies of the armored infantry battalions in armored brigades. I myself was trained in the Combat Troop School 3, also known as the Tank Destroyer School, in Munster, the Tank Destroyer Training Battalion subordinate to Combat Troop School 3 with its 3 companies, the Tank Destroyer Training Companies 70 and 90, and on the 1st Airborne Anti-Tank Training Company, 270, which was established on May 1, 1966. With its subordination to the Airborne Brigade 27, which was established on April 1, 1970, the training designation was then dropped for Company 270. From September 1967, I was in the Anti-Tank Training Company 70, where I was initially trained as a gunner on the tank destroyer. Then in January and February 68, in the 8-week preliminary NCO course and the subsequent 9-week junior NCO course for commanders, which took place shortly after, in the 7th inspection of the anti-tank school. I was then promoted to junior NCO on August 1st, 68, transferred to the aforementioned 7th inspection of the anti-tank school, where I served as an instructor until October, in a 3-month cadet course for privates to become junior anti-tank NCOs. Here, on the occasion of a group evening, the senior room occupant reports the group to me before we sat together over beer in a civilian pub. Notice the year 1968. The dress code was still observed after duty. Back to the gun tank destroyers, the independent tank destroyer companies, and the anti-tank platoons in the mechanized infantry battalions, starting in 1970 with Army Structure 3 tank destroyer battalions, were also added. A good dozen years later, starting in 83, the end of the tank destroyers was ushered in. Because the penetrating power of its 90-90mm cannon was no longer sufficient against the Soviet T-64 tanks introduced in the Warsaw Pact since 1972, and the T-72 main battle tanks introduced in the NVA starting in 1973. The successors were 316 Jaguar 1 missile tank destroyers, which were introduced between 78 and 82. They were converted from the Raketenjagdpanzer II tank destroyers that had been delivered to the troops in 1967, and with the Hati anti-tank guided missile, they could be effective up to 4 kilometers. The gun tank destroyers that were freed up as a result were either converted into armored vehicles by removing the gun, for example for use by forward artillery observers, or as armored mortars, or they were stored as intact gun tank destroyers in depots, for use in the Homeland Defense Brigades and the inactive Homeland Defense Regiments. Here, during the Army Exercise National Defense 88. The 4 tank destroyers out of a total of 7 gun tank destroyers of the Tank Destroyer Platoon of Homeland Defense Regiment 84. Hessen-Darmstadt, which were brought in from the depot, but broke down within 24 hours due to technical defects and were towed back to the depot. As for the branch of the tank destroyers, when the Bundeswehr was being established, they wore the metal attachment insignia modeled after the U.S. Army as their own branch insignia, but then had dark green collar tabs, which were replaced in 1959. From the hunter green of the infantry, which made the tank destroyers a part of the infantry, until they were assigned to the armored troops, received pink collar tabs, and wore black berets. In 2006, the tank destroyer branch was finally decommissioned. Which also brings me to the so-called experimental carrier, developed basically in parallel with the Kanonenjagdpanzer, a 90mm anti-tank gun with a built-in auxiliary engine. However, my inquiry to the press department of the developer Rheinmetall in Düsseldorf went unanswered, so I have to rely on the information about this planned gun that I received, for example, from soldiers of the Panzerjäger Lehrkompanie 70 who were tasked with troop testing in the mid-1960s. Here are the details. Caliber 90mm, so the same ammunition as that used by the U.S. main battle tanks M47, M47, M48, and the German Kanonenjagdpanzer. Length in combat configuration, 7.03 meters. Height in combat configuration, 1.40 meters. Width in combat configuration, 2 meters. The ground clearance was 38 centimeters with a fording depth of just under 1 meter. The climbing ability was up to 50 degrees. Essentially, the weapon system consisted of a chassis on which the cannon and the protective shield were mounted, as well as the engine and the steering and braking system. 8 smoke grenade launchers were attached to the protective shield to release smoke grenades. A conventional and an active infrared sight were also mounted on the gun. The cannon could be steered both by a steering wheel acting on the rear twin wheels and by turning brakes, which are called steering levers in armored vehicles. At the front, the weapon system had 2 large coarse-tread off-road tires. In addition to the 3 seats for the operating crew, there were compartments for an unknown number of shells. The ready ammunition, although due to the limited storage space, there were certainly no more than 6 to 8. For firing from a partially covered position, the chassis was lowered at the rear, with the rear wheels being pushed backward. Then, 2 earth spurs were hydraulically extended to anchor the gun. The cannon was unlocked and pushed forward, which further reduced the already low firing height of about 1.40 meters. If a target had been engaged and the situation required an immediate change of position, after firing, the spurs were retracted. The rear wheels were returned to the driving position, and the barrel was pulled back and locked. Now, I have repeatedly mentioned the 90mm anti-tank gun with a built-in auxiliary engine. It was specially developed by Porsche. However, this also means that the information found on an internet source stating that 3 soldiers were intended to operate it, namely a loader, a gunner, and a driver, is only partially correct, because this source overlooks the fact that the auxiliary engine, which could accelerate the 5-ton cannon mounted on a self-propelled carriage with auxiliary drive up to 20 kilometers per hour, was not intended for longer relocations, but only for faster position changes in combat situations, instead of having a dozen soldiers push the equipment. Besides, it would have been completely absurd to equip the tank destroyer platoon with this system, or a grenadier battalion equipped with Unimog, or an HS-30 Panzer Grenadier battalion, in case of deployment, to have them crawl along at 20 km/h behind the trucks or armored personnel carriers, but that would make it useless as a support weapon and also an easy target for enemy aircraft. Therefore, for rapid deployment from the barracks or the staging area, it was planned to tow the anti-tank gun with a truck, which was also considered part of the weapons system, because without a towing vehicle, the gun could not be brought into action. Just as little as the light field howitzers 105, which were also used by the Bundeswehr from 1956, could be brought into action with a U.S. truck. As you can see in the picture, a few German soldiers were still wearing the old paratrooper helmet at that time. On the tractor, which was manned by 2 soldiers, driver and co-driver, In addition to the personal equipment of the three-man gun crew, the ammunition intended for the cannon was also to be transported. Heat, high-explosive anti-tank rounds for fighting tanks, and for engaging softer targets. HESH, high-explosive squash head rounds. But after the system was thoroughly tested by the troops, it was still not adopted. But not for the reasons you can read on the internet, namely, quote, high system costs and the penetration power of the 90mm gun, which was considered insufficient compared to the increasing requirements. Ammunition against the reactive and composite armor of modern main battle tanks. Because, first of all, at that time, very few tanks of the Warsaw Pact had such armor. And secondly, the gun mounted on the anti-tank gun with auxiliary engine was also used in the Kanonenjagdpanzer until the late 1980s. No, as several sergeants from Tank Destroyer Company 70 who were involved in the troop trials assured me, the main reason was the lack of a suitable off-road capable towing vehicle that was strong and heavy enough to safely and reliably transport the unbraked gun, the 3 operating soldiers, and the ammunition. The 5-ton MAN 630, affectionately called Emma, which had been considered, was pushed sideways by the gun during trials, which meant it was ruled out for safety reasons, and an off-road capable 7-ton truck only became available to the troops in the 1970s. So the few anti-tank guns with auxiliary engines that were produced for testing remained one-of-a-kind pieces, and I have no information about their later whereabouts. Instead, the Bundeswehr procured the cannon and missile tank destroyers, which could be used equally in a combined arms battle alongside infantry fighting vehicles and main battle tanks.